Good evening. So when I was contemplating talking to you this evening, I had a good old debate with myself as to whether I should prepare some thoughts and notes or whether I should just leave a lovely space and allow inspiration to flourish. But as you can see, I have prepared some notes because the one thing I do know is that inspiration does not come when summoned, when commanded, when bidden. So my notes. When I left here, having read PPE, I would describe the first 7 years of my working life as a quest for inspiration, because I had what I thought was a great idea for a book. I was going to write a book about a female James Bond, and I thought, combined with that idea and a reasonable facility for writing, I really ought to be able to produce something like that. And I tried, and I tried, and I tried, and many years later, when I moved out of the flat I lived in at the time, I discovered about 40 page ones. And I never managed to get beyond page one, and I had sought inspiration everywhere. 7 years I'd sought inspiration, and it came one day in a very unlikely way, in a very unlikely place. I was sitting at my trading desk. I was working for a big US investment bank called Credit Suisse First Boston, and, well, US and obviously a bit Swiss. And I was very, very angry. I was furious with my boss. I can't remember what he had done, but he'd done something to really annoy me. And I sat at my trading desk and I thought, I was feeling very rebellious, probably a bit petulant. And I thought, how much damage can I do here? I can probably go out into the markets and buy hundreds of millions of dollars worth of deeply dodgy financial assets before I'm going to get hauled off in handcuffs. And before you say, well, actually, I thought that's what traders did, well, I'd like to think that I used a bit more discretion in my normal trading activities. And then I thought, actually, that's no fun. It would be a lot more fun to think of a way to make a huge amount of money illegally. And then, to my absolute combination of joy and horror, I came up with what I thought was the perfect crime really quickly. And it involved insider trading in the foreign exchange markets, and I won't go into the mechanics of it, but in case you're tempted. But I thought to myself, you know, this is the perfect crime, and in certain scenarios it would be almost undetectable, so I'm sure somebody's doing it. And if not, why not? And that epiphany, that moment of inspiration, could have sent me off in two directions, I suppose. One, I could have gone and done it, and I hasten to add I didn't. Or two, I could have gone home and written about it, which is what I did. I went home that night and I started writing, and I wrote for another 6 months. And then I quit the bank and I continued to write, and this is the result. And it was, as I say, a quest of 7 years in the making, and that one flash of inspiration that came, I don't know, you can tell me afterwards what you think my brainwaves were doing, but it was anger. It wasn't a particularly poetic kind of inspiration, but it produced that book. And it's interesting because I've gone on to write probably 12 books since, but this book has been by far and away the most successful, probably by a factor of 10. And that led me to wonder why. And I think it's something to do with inspiration and where inspiration comes from. I'm sure you're all familiar with the hierarchy of competence. At the top, there's the unconscious competent, then the conscious competent, then the conscious incompetent, and right at the bottom of the pile, the unconscious incompetent. Well, I think I was, when I wrote this book, an unconscious competent. And my subconscious had a huge role to play in writing it. But once it had been written, published, and done very well, the books I wrote subsequently, in theory, I knew how to write. I knew how to create a book and get it published. And I think I was far more self-conscious. And I think as a result, the books, although they did fine, they didn't have the same success. They didn't manage to chime with so many readers as this book did, which sold millions of copies around the world and did evoke a response from people. And I think that act of the subconscious mind is much more powerful than a conscious intellectual way of approaching writing. which actually raises a disturbing question then, which is, can you teach creative writing? Now, obviously, that's a bit of a seditious thing to say in a centre of learning. I certainly think you can teach editing. You can take a body of work and you can make it a lot better than it was. But whether you can teach that creative spark, I don't know. I leave that out there for discussion. One thing you can do, I think, is feed the subconscious. And how do you do that? Well, for me, one of the ways in which I'm doing it is being here as writer in residence, having conversations, stimulating conversations with a range of extremely bright people and a range of fascinating specialities. And that fills what I would call the creative well. And there's another thing that I do, which is I go for incredibly long walks, 2-hour walks plus, and I think I get into a kind of meditative state. And it's a combination almost of intellect and inspiration then, because I will pose questions to myself about plot developments, about characters, and gradually the answers will come to me. And I always dictate them into my phone, because I know that if I don't, they will come and they will go, and I won't remember them. And so the walking and the calmness is a very good way of making it more likely that inspiration will come, because I think inspiration is rather like happiness. You can't chase it, but you can do some of the things that are likely to make it more probable that it will come. And I'm going to finish this evening with a very strange story about the nature of inspiration. And Charlie's wonderful quotation from Sri Aurobindo about inspiration being a slender river of brightness leaping from a vast and eternal knowledge. Well, I wonder about that knowledge, what it is. If it's almost preternatural, and if it can be premonitory. So this story begins with this book, Sea Gin. When I was living in the Middle East, I went for a walk on the beach one morning, seeking inspiration, and I found a shell, and I looked at the inside of the shell, and it looked like a map. And I thought to myself, what if this were a map of some hidden kingdom at sea? And what if my protagonist had to, this is a children's book, had to go to this hidden kingdom run by an evil empire to rescue his parents who had been kidnapped at sea? Wouldn't that be interesting? And I went home. It was a good epiphany, a moment of inspiration. And I started writing the book, and I had written 100 pages, including the kidnap at sea and including my hero going to try and rescue his parents, when I got kidnapped at sea by the Iranian regime. And I hasten to add, this was not a research trip, and neither was it a publicity stunt, because the book wasn't out at that stage. And happily, I was released after 2 weeks, and I came home and I finished the book with considerably greater insight, and I had it published. And then I was giving a talk to the Abu Dhabi Men's College, and after I'd finished, all the students came up to me and they said, you know, you should never have written that book. I said, what book? And they said, the book about the sea. I said, oh, sea gin. And they went, oh, don't say the word, because to say the word gin in a large swathe of the Middle East is to invoke their presence, is to summon them. So they thought, and please, Gin, if you're here, stay away. They thought because I'd said the word, I had invoked them. Because I'd written a book about them, I had invoked my own fate. Now, had I don't know. That's pretty out there, and I leave it out there. But it did raise the question of when I had that epiphany, that moment of inspiration, had I actually foreseen my own fate? And had I just condensed it into a novel and not looked closely enough at that moment? I don't know. I leave that out there too. All I will say is that inspiration, when it strikes, is incredibly powerful, and that maybe when it does, we really need to look very closely to make sure that there's no hidden meaning. Thank you.